Thanks for listening to Convincing Proof. In this session, I want to talk about the recent attempt to assassinate Donald Trump and the rise of political rhetoric. Now, political rhetoric is nothing new. It's been around forever. But over the last few years, its intensity has skyrocketed. This has caused many people to struggle with anxiety, fear, frustration, anger, and even hatred. It can get people so worked up that they feel compelled to take extreme, even violent actions. Now, as of July 19th, 2024, we don't know for sure the motives of the man who tried to assassinate Trump. But I think it's reasonable to assume that extreme rhetoric played a role in creating this horrendous event where people were injured and one man even lost his life. So here, what I'm going to try to do is explain how and why political rhetoric comes about. And my hope is that if we all better understand rhetoric, then there'll be less of a chance it'll make us, again, angry, anxious, and hateful. And also in this, I want to encourage both sides to tone down the rhetoric. Now, those who want to lead, they have to learn how to motivate people to listen to them and follow their leadership. And this is true in every area, whether it's sports coaches, church pastors, business executives, military commanders, political leaders, etc. And there are many appropriate ways that leaders can motivate people to follow their leadership. Good leaders inspire, exhort, and encourage by their outstanding example, compelling insights, appealing character, and rousing speeches, of course. Praise God for such leaders and the key role that they play in our lives. However, there are some downright immoral, deceptive tactics that leaders can use to motivate people to follow their leadership. And these deceptive tactics are very, very tempting. These deceptive tactics are especially tempting when there are multiple people competing against each other for leadership and the power and influence that comes along with it. The most well-known deceptive tactic is overpromising. And this was hilariously illustrated in the movie you might remember, Napoleon Dynamite, where Pedro, Napoleon's friend Pedro, was running for high school class president. He proclaimed that if you vote for me, all your wildest dreams will come true. Now, politicians are famous for promising things they have absolutely no control over. I always chuckle when a politician promises they're going to improve the economy because politicians have about as much control over the economy as they do the weather. But because this overpromising tactic is so well known and easy to spot, most of us don't get worked up over it, and we take whatever politicians promise with a grain, sometimes a cup, of salt. However, there's another deceptive tactic that's a bit more insidious, often referred to as the scare tactic. Now, leaders employ this tactic by exaggerating the dangers we'd face if their leadership isn't followed. Sometimes a leader will even invent a danger or an enemy that's going to harm us unless we follow their leadership because they can best protect us from this fabricated danger. Consider, for example, how Hitler convinced so many Germans that Jews were the enemy, harmful and dangerous. Or consider a fictional example, how in the prequel Star Wars movies, Palpatine orchestrated the Separatist crisis in order to convince the Galactic Senate to give him emergency powers, which eventually led to him becoming the authoritarian emperor. Now, I understand that's fictional, but it was based on numerous situations in history where a leader uses deceptive scare tactics like this to convince people to give him more power so that he can, quote, protect them from some fabricated danger or enemy. Cult leaders are incredibly good at scare tactics like this. I've done a lot of research for a book that I'm writing on Jim Jones's cult, the People's Temple. And I tell you, he was a master in scare tactics. Now, instead of completely inventing a danger or an enemy, what's more common is that leaders will take something that really is somewhat dangerous and exaggerate how dangerous it is, and or exaggerate how much they can really protect us from it. I've seen church leaders do this with demons. Are there demons that can influence and tempt us? You better believe it. But I've seen church leaders exaggerate the danger of demons and or how much they can protect us from them in an attempt to scare people into following or financially supporting their leadership. Are there terrorists that can harm us? Absolutely. But government or military leaders can exaggerate the danger of terrorists in an attempt to scare us into giving them more power or giving up our freedoms under the ruse that by doing so, they'll be better able to protect us. Now, politicians often use this scare tactic by claiming that if the opponent they're running against gets elected, then terrible, horrible things will happen. Now, full disclosure here, I'm a registered Republican. I've always voted for Republicans, mostly because of the abortion issue, and I don't foresee that changing anytime soon. I do believe that some of the policies promoted by Democrats are dangerous and potentially harmful. However, I'll be the first to admit that Republicans are just as bad as Democrats in using these scare tactics. This sort of scare tactic rhetoric has grown in fervor and intensity over the last several years. Politicians, the news media, and everyday citizens are proclaiming that the world's going to come to an end if the wrong person gets elected. If so-and-so becomes president, they'll destroy America. And this sort of rhetoric has led to anxiety, fear, frustration, anger, and hatred on both sides. It can even get people so worked up that they feel compelled to take extreme, violent actions. So what can we do to help tone down the rhetoric and prevent ourselves from getting all worked up? Here's a few recommendations that I have. First, don't buy into the rhetoric. Understand what politicians are doing. If you think Trump is Hitler or Biden is Stalin, then you've bought into the rhetoric. Just recognize that politicians are going to exaggerate how dangerous their opponent is. That's just how the game is played. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes I actually feel bad for politicians. If they didn't exaggerate, sensationalize things, if they just calmly and rationally stuck to the issues, hardly anybody would listen to them. So just understand that by the nature of the beast, this is how things work. They have to exaggerate and sensationalize things just to get people to listen to them. But if we understand this, realize that they're exaggerating in their rhetoric, we'll take everything they say with a grain of salt and hopefully not get so worked up by it. Second, recognize even the politicians themselves understand that their rhetoric is exaggerated. This became crystal clear after the attempt to assassinate Trump. Before that, Democratic leaders were calling him Hitler and saying he'd ruin democracy. But then after the assassination attempt, they all said that they're glad he survived and were praying for him to recover. Now, you just don't say those things if you really believe he's the next Hitler that's going to ruin democracy. Third, don't be a part of contributing to the rhetoric. Don't use inflammatory words or fanciful descriptions of the politicians you disagree with. I tend to describe people the way that they want to be described. Use their own terms. Whether I'm debating atheists or people that I disagree with concerning politics. And then calmly, rationally, and respectfully explain why you disagree with them. Now, taking this approach, you're not going to get as many people's attention or as many likes on social media as you would if you would over-sensationalize, but that's not what this is about. An exaggerated sensational insult doesn't really change anybody's mind anyway. It only gets people more stirred up. Those that already agree with you to hate the politician more, and those that disagree with you to despise your preferred politician more. So it really accomplishes nothing. However, a calm, rational, respectful approach, though it won't get as much attention or as many likes, has the potential to actually change someone's mind. Fourth, acknowledge when your candidates on your side, exaggerate in their rhetoric. I'll be the first to admit that Trump is the king of exaggeration, always has been. You can even call them out for it in a respectful way. A kind rebuke from a friend goes much further than a sharp critique from an opponent. Fifth, don't allow any leaders in your life to have more power and control over you than is appropriate. Certainly, there's a proper place for leadership authority in the family, in the church, and the government, and we should obey the authority in all these areas. You can check out my sermon on the biblical role of government on our Convincing Proof YouTube channel. It's called A Separation of Purpose: How Much Should Christians Be Involved in Government? A sermon that I did mostly on Romans 13. But my point here is just to be aware of those politicians who use deception to try to gain more power for themselves. 6, don't hate the people that you disagree with. It's possible to confidently argue for your position without being a jerk. It's not always easy, but it is possible. When you get frustrated by people you disagree with, take a break, step back. This happens to all of us. Remind yourselves that they're human beings made in God's image, and they do have some viable points to consider. And remind yourselves that they are your fellow Americans. If you step back and think about it as Americans, it's amazing how much Democrats and Republicans actually agree about at the end of the day, even though this is hardly ever highlighted, especially in an election year. And then lastly, 7th, don't become too much of a fanboy. In other words, don't worship, admire, or put too much hope in any politician. Don't praise your favorite politician more than is appropriate. Don't expect that they're going to be able to accomplish all that they promise. Remember, they're only human, and regardless of what they promise, they're not going to be able to fix most, if any, of the world's problems. Most importantly, remind yourself that ultimately we should trust God. Trust that God is working out his promises in the midst of all this chaos and humans striving for power. And remind yourselves that only God can ultimately fix the root of what makes our world so terrible: us. Thanks again for listening to Convincing Proof.